a lot has happened this week in the Hope Chest. We've got Mr. Martin got caught by the Palmer agents. We've got Chloe and Violet arguing about their brother. We've got senators flying the coop and Violet chasing him down in the Hope Chest. And yeah, lots of good stuff going on. So today we're going to keep reading pages 217 through 224. There'll be another car that's introduced briefly in this reading today, and it's called an Oakland Sensible 6, and that's that car on the top. Much classier than the Model T. This is a very high-end, expensive, nice car compared to what Violet was driving. And then we also, there's a second where it talks about the interurban electric train, and it was a railway that connected Tennessee to these big cities on the East Coast. I couldn't find a picture of the Tennessee one, but this is one in Portland. This is an interurban electric train that was in Portland during that same era. So this is probably what it would have looked like. So, let's get to reading. All right, so Violet just got off the sidewalk, and she's back on the road again. I don't care what anyone says, she heard a woman on the sidewalk say. There ought to be a law against children driving those things. She had the hang of it now. The important thing was to keep moving, because otherwise the Hope Chest might stall, and she knew she couldn't start it again, and that none of the agitated crowd on the sidewalk would help her. Which way to the highway, she called. Several people pointed, and someone called, Left at the corner, and take your second right. Behind her, Violet heard a bell clanging angrily. It was a trolley car. Violet was driving right down the middle of the trolley track in the middle of the street. She looked over to the side where she was supposed to drive, but the space looked too dangerously narrow. Well, the trolley would just have to follow her. Soon Violet had left the trolley track and the city behind, and the Hope Chest was bouncing merrily along a rutted dirt road into the country. Violet could see why Chloe liked the Hope Chest so much. This was glorious. It made you feel free, as if you had no bonds at all, nothing to hold you back from going wherever you wanted and doing whatever you needed to be done. She saw a car up ahead on the edge of the dusty highway. She took her hand off the throttle and slowed down. A cream-colored Oakland Sensible 6 was stopped beside the road, and a man was kneeling in the dust beside it, staring at a rear wheel. Violet pulled up beside the Oakland and stopped the Hope Chest carefully, not letting it stall. The man looked up. He was in his 40s and had rather the seedy look of a drummer, perhaps because he'd left his hat on, although he'd taken off his jacket and pulled up his sleeves under his sleeve garters. Are you Mr. Credwell or Mr. Blotz? Violet called to him. Beg pardon, said the man, standing up and brushing dust off his knees. You'll have to turn that thing off. I can't hear you. With a sigh of regret, Violet let the Hope Chest stall. Are you Mr. Credwell or Mr. Blotz? The man tipped his hat politely. Credwell, got a flat, and me without a spare. Well, that's one of the legislators found anyway. Where's Blotz? She said. I don't know, said Mr. Credwell, shrugging. The committee's about to meet to vote on whether to send the ratification bill to the floor, Violet said. You're supposed to be there to vote. Oh, is it? Mr. Credwell looked off into the middle distance. I guess it was in my memorandum book, but I must have forgotten to look at it. Violet almost pounded the steering wheel in frustration. Did this man have no idea how much the vote mattered to Chloe and to women who had to wait in train stations for their sons' coffins to come home from France, and to a few million other people, including now that Violet thought about it herself? Mr. Credwell, please come back to town at once. Mr. Credwell shuffled his feet in the dust with the guilty look of a boy caught skipping school. Sure, I was just headed back. His car was pointed the other way. Mr. Credwell chivalrously offered to turn the crank to start the Hope Chest. Violet worked the levers. It took them quite a while to get the thing started because she didn't have a good ear for it yet. You know why they call it a runabout, don't you? Said Mr. Credwell. Violet had heard this one before, and they were all supposed to do their best to keep legislators in a good mood, so she said, Why? Because it'll run about a mile before it breaks down. Ha 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 ha, said Mr. Credwell. Violet smiled politely. Now, if you think I've got bad jokes, Mr. Credwell, come on. Violet smiled politely. Ha ha, please, get it, Mr. Credwell. Do you mind if I drive, Miss Mayhew, said Violet, and yes, I do. Mr. Credwell humbly climbed into the Hope Chest and permitted himself to be driven back to town. He asked Violet to stop at a garage so he could get a spare, so Violet did. But once he'd got it, she went right on driving back to the Capitol. Miss Politzer had caught the other legislator, Blotz, trying to escape on the interurban, the electric train system that connected cities from the East Coast to the Mississippi River. That night, the committee voted 10-8 to send the Susan B. Anthony Amendment to the floor. Without Mr. Blotz and Mr. Credwell, Violet realized the vote would have been tied. The next day, Tuesday, August 17th, Violet did not see Chloe or Myrtle at all. Everyone thought the amendment would be voted on that day. Violet went to their usual noon meeting place at Max Bloomstein's pharmacy, but Chloe did not show up. Violet slowly sipped a chocolate phosphate through a paper straw and worried. What if they had arrested Chloe, too? Why would they, though? Chloe hadn't done anything, but then, according to Chloe, all Mr. Martin had done was speak out against the war. So, who knew what people could get arrested for? And anyway, Chloe had been to jail before. The door jangled 17 times before the last of the phosphate gurgled in the bottom of Violet's glass, but it was never Chloe. With a sigh, Violet got up and left. On the way back to the Hermitage, Violet heard a newsboy hollering that some baseball player had been hit by a fast pitch and killed. That would upset Mr. Martin, Violet thought, if he ever heard about it, that is. Who knew where he was being kept or what was being done to him or to Chloe or to Myrtle? Turning these worries over in her head, Violet walked across the sweltering lobby of the Hermitage and heard someone calling her name. She was surprised to see that it was Mr. Hanover, the non-Bolshevik Jewish lawyer from Memphis, who was leading the house fight. Imagine him remembering her name. She was glad and slightly proud of herself to see that Mr. Hanover had no bump on his head and had not been locked in the hold of a slow freighter heading south out of New Orleans. "How do you do, Mr. Hanover?" she said politely. She looked curiously at the enormous blond man standing just behind Mr. Hanover's shoulder. Governor Roberts had indeed gotten Mr. Hanover a bodyguard. A huge one. Fine, said Mr. Hanover. Actually, I think I'm getting an ulcer, but that's neither here nor there. Listen. Could you tell your sister that she doesn't need to bother with Mr. Ezekiel? I heard she was looking for him, but Mr. Ezekiel's ours. In fact, I'll tell you a funny story. Violet had already heard from Myrtle the story of how Mr. Ezekiel had told Mr. Hanover the Antis had offered him $300 for his vote, and had tried to get Mr. Hanover to offer him more. But she hadn't heard it from Mr. Hanover, so she laughed politely. Mr. Hanover was a nice fella. In spite of his baldness, he really wasn't much older than Chloe. About Mr. Martin's age, maybe. Violet suddenly felt that there was something really good about people who fought for the rights of other people, and she wished there was some way that she could tell Mr. Hanover that. Mr. Hanover, I'm not really an anti, and thank you. She unpinned the red rose from her dress and handed it to Mr. Hanover, keeping the pin because it would ruin the gesture if she stabbed him in the hand. She supposed Mr. Hanover must have known she wasn't an anti, or he wouldn't have told her the story, but she felt better for saying it anyway. She wondered why Mr. Hanover thought Chloe had been looking for Mr. Ezekiel. She couldn't ever remember seeing a question mark next to Mr. Ezekiel's name. She went back up to her room. It was sweltering hot. Miss Esquadrille was laundering her bloomers in the wash basin. Violet turned on the fan. She didn't care whether Miss Esquadrille minded or not, and flopped down on the bed. "There you are!" Miss Esquadrille came out of the bathroom and hung a pair of black bloomers on the line she'd strung. "You know the House might vote today. We're all supposed to show up there and show the colors. Where's your rose?" "I'm not wearing it anymore," said Violet. "I'm for women's suffrage, Miss Esquadrille." Surprisingly, Miss Esquadrille took this in stride. "You know, I'm beginning to wonder if I might be too. I was saying to myself, Anisette, you're not even married, so all this cleaning the household applesauce doesn't really apply to yourself anyway." "You didn't say that to yourself. I said that to you," said Violet irritably. "It's not only that, Miss Esquadrille went on as if Violet had not spoken. "There are probably lots of women who are married, and they're still not queens of the household, or maybe the household they're the queen of is some one-room shack with no floor beside the railroad track, and maybe it's really not my business to decide whether they should vote or not. And anyway, who's to say I wouldn't do a good job of voting once I set my mind to it?" Violet stared at Miss Esquadrille as if she had sprouted horns. "Did you just change sides?" she asked Miss Esquadrille. Miss Esquadrille gave her a bewildered look. I think I did." She shook out another pair of bloomers and hung them up. Alrighty. Thanks for listening. We're on page 224, and there is 259 pages, so we will probably finish this book next week. So thanks so much for listening.